G'day buddies, I am Jacaro Toro, and this is another video in the series Straya BB, Australia before the British. And as you can see, there are a number of names and years written inside Australia today. And that is because today's question is, when did the Europeans discover Australia? And what were the early contacts like between the Europeans and the Australian Aborigines, that is? Well, some have suggested that Portuguese sailors might have seen Australia in the 1520s, but this is unclear whether this really happened. This is disputed. This guy here, Willem Janszoon, is the first one we know of that both saw Australia and actually visited Australia. He was a Dutch sailor, as the name implies, and he was following the southern coast of Papua, the island up here, exploring and chartering the southern coast. And he came to Cape York here, this peninsula here, and he thought it was still part of Papua, that he was still following the Papuan coastline. So he stopped in a number of places. He sailed along here, around 350 kilometers along Cape York. That would be around 220 miles. Yes, and he and his crew, they were met by hostility in all the places where they stopped, except for in the last place. When they had sailed 350 kilometers, there the Aborigines were more friendly, until Janszoon and his crew appropriated some women, as it was called, as they expressed it there where I read it. And violence broke out, and lots of people were killed on both sides. So this was in 1606, and as it so happens, the local Aboriginal tribe preserved knowledge or the memory of this event in stories up until modern times. That would be the time we live in now, I suppose. So the Dutch early on established their colony up on Java, where their capital was Batavia, today's Jakarta. And in 1611, another Dutch captain, Hendrik Brouwer, he discovered the Roaring Forties. That is the area between roughly 40 and 50 degrees latitude south from Africa. In the Roaring Forties, the winds are blowing eastwards towards Asia and Australia. And this discovery made trips to Batavia from Europe much quicker. And it became compulsory already in 1617 for Dutch ships to make use of the Roaring Forties. So the idea was to sail in the Roaring Forties and then make a sharp turn north at some point. But this at some point was the problem. You see, in those days there was no easy way to determine longitudes. So they really didn't know how far they had come from Africa towards Asia at any given point. So that ships came to the Australian coastline was inevitable. Shipwrecks were also inevitable, and landfalls. And I have heard that this led to some Aboriginal tribes along Australia's western coast being much more pale. That would be pale in skin than Aboriginal tribes in the rest of the continent. I am not 100% sure if this is indeed the case, but that is what I have heard. We will soon come to quite a number of men that were left here in this area. We'll get to that soon. First, we have Dirk Hartog, who was the first one not to make a turn north when he should have. And he came to Shark Bay, which is around here. I have been there. They landed, he and his crew landed on an uninhabited island, which bears his name today. Dirk Hartog Island. Well, that's probably not how they say it in Australia, but still. I have been there, not to the island, but to Monkey Mia, which is right nearby. Yes, the place is called Monkey Mia. Actually, look it up on a map if you like. So he called this land here Eendrachtsland, simply because the ship he was the captain of was the Eendracht. Yes, and 3 years later, in 1619, two Dutch ships who also had not made the turn north when they probably should have, they came to Eendrachtsland and made landfall here along the western Australian coast. And then we have this John Brooke, or Brooks, who was the captain of the Trial, and he and his crew, they were the first Brits to see the Australian mainland. What happened was that they got shipwrecked on Montebello Islands. That's an archipelago, 127 islands, roughly in this area here. And Brooks, or Brooke, and his son, and slightly more than half of the crew, they set out in smaller boats and made it to Java eventually. But they actually left no less than 92 men there on the Montebello Islands. Yes. The Trial was the name of the ship. So then we have Francois Thiessen or something. I'm not quite sure about that name. He was Dutch-French, and he sailed very much far to south. He came down here to the southwesternmost point of Australia, Cape Lewin. And then he continued to sail along the coast here and mapped more than 1,500 kilometers from Albany, Western Australia, to Seduna, South Australia. Now I don't know actually exactly where that is, perhaps somewhere here. Then we should move to Abel Tasman. I'm sure the name Tasmania is familiar. He sighted the west coast of Tasmania on the 24th of November of 1642. They tried to get into land, but the weather prevented them, high waves and so on. And in the end, one man swam ashore with a Dutch flag and planted it on Tasmania. Tasmania, which the Aussies call Tassie, by the way. As I said in an earlier video, they really don't like long words. Long words have to be shortened. Yes, Tasman, he was back a couple of years later, mapping the north coast of Australia, which he called New Holland, a name that obviously didn't stick. And then we have this man here, William Dampier, who has given a name to lots of places in Australia, to the Dampier Peninsula in Western Australia, for example, and one university, and lots of places. He was there twice. The first time in 1688, actually he set out to try to find the trial possibly, the ship that John Brooke had and that had got shipwrecked. And he is the first Englishman to set foot on Australian mainland, as we know anyway. The first Englishman to be recorded to have set foot on the Australian mainland. Who knows what happened to the 92 men John Brooke left behind? I don't know. So anyway, he set out to find the trial. That didn't happen because that ship was discovered only in 1969 at a place that at that time was called Ritchie's Reef, but which was renamed as Trial Rocks. Anyway, Dampier, he came to King's Sound up here. The ship stopped in different places. He made notes on the flora and fauna and the indigenous population, and evidently they were not too hostile. They didn't try to kill Dampier and his men anyway. And then he returned in 1699. He came to Shark Bay, sailed past Dirk Hartog Island actually, and made landfall there, and made more notes about flora and fauna. And he is the first one to describe Australia's big hopping animals. Those that got their name, the name we know them by, kangaroo, by James Cook. James Cook is later, of course. He was out traveling in the second half of the 1700s. His two expeditions, well, the first one was sent out in 1768, and the second one in 1772. And actually, James Cook and others, they were still in the 1700s out looking for Terra Australis, as it's called in Latin. That means southern land, hence the name for Australia. This is an idea that comes from Roman antiquity, actually, that there must be, or at least there should be, a continent in the southern hemisphere that sort of balances all the land there is in the northern hemisphere. And this idea is documented in the 5th century AD on maps made by one Macrobius. Discworld fans of the Discworld books will be familiar with the idea of the counterweight continent. Yes, that is what Terra Australis is. And actually, they hadn't realized that Australia, the big land that they had started to discover in the early 1600s, actually was this Terra Australis. So James Cook was out looking. So was a Frenchman, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who is the first one that we know of, the first European that we know of to have seen the Great Barrier Reef here on this side. Also the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe, which is something that William Dampier did no less than 3 times, by the way. It seems that he had itchy feet. He didn't want to stay back in England for too long. Anyway, I'm thinking perhaps I should do a separate video about James Cook, since he is a man who is incredibly important in present-day Australia, in their understanding of their history and so on. So important, in fact, so that the cottage where he was born in Yorkshire was dismantled in Yorkshire, shipped to Australia and rebuilt in Melbourne, which seems a little bit absurd to me, I must say. But that is indeed the case. Anyone who wants to can go see it in Melbourne. I have been there myself. So I suppose we could say that is the oldest building in Australia. Anyway, I think this will be all for today. So, see you later.